Good morning, everybody. Here we are, Biology 1, Mr. Lin. This will be, I guess, one of my first virtual lectures of the year, so we'll be doing this a lot. Our topic today is experimental design. The first unit in this course is called The Nature of Science, and what that is all about is how to design and conduct experiments, and what science is, what biology is, and let's get into it. So I'm guessing most of you have done a science experiment at some point in your educational career. And so a lot of this will be review of some sort. But let's start by just looking at this statement right here that science answers questions with experiments. So that's a great um, way to think about what science is. Some people might say science is a way of knowing. Science is a problem-solving procedure. It's it is a way of looking at the world and a way to reason through problems. And generally, what scientists do to answer those problems is conduct experiments. They form a body of knowledge that can then help society. So, how is it done? The first thing to talk about here is, well, what is our problem? Um, what is the question that we have to ask, whether it be a biology question or a physics question or whatever it might be? There's that the question really comes from observations, and those observations lead to asking questions like why? Not like why did the chicken cross the road, but questions like why is the sky blue? And scientists have answered that question by going through this process and come up with an answer that we think is right. But something to mention at this point is that science is not necessarily the same as truth. Uh, Science can be changed as we learn more. And that's at the very core of science is skepticism, questioning, um, validity, backing up statements with observational facts and data. And so the science is this kind of constantly changing thing that has evolved over the millennia. We used to think that the Earth was the center of the solar system. It's a good thing that we've revised that worldview. And our current worldview, I'm sure, will be revised as we develop more sophisticated technologies and that sort of thing. So we start by asking a question about the topic. What is a good question? Well, science questions have to be testable. And that's something students usually struggle with a little bit is how do I generate a testable question? What kinds of data can we collect about the question? And will it lend itself to some sort of conclusion? So think for a moment. I'll pause the video about what a testable question might be. Okay, hopefully you paused the video and stopped. One of our first things we'll do this year is we're going to generate testable questions. You're going to go through this experimental process, and I'll help you though. We're going to use a local phenomenon known as eutrophication as kind of a basis for this question asking, and we'll be growing some algae in the first couple of weeks as a kind of our experiments that we do. But I'll get back to that later. But the answer to this is, if you have the materials to do it, to answer the question through some sort of experimentation. We don't just answer the questions based on what we think is going to happen. We actually have to do some real life testing. Usually the scientific process, once we've defined the problem, we will need to develop a hypothesis. So what do we think is going to happen here based on kind of what we know about the situation, maybe some background research that we've conducted. And it's Not necessarily an educated guess. I like to use a prediction. It sounds a little bit more sciencey. Guessing, it seems like you're not drawing on prior knowledge or any research that you've done. So there is a format that we write our hypotheses in. We use the if, then, because statement. And you might have had other teachers have a slightly different format. It's all kind of the same. What do you think is going to happen in the experiment? Relate your variables here, and we'll talk about those in a second, and use some logic. And so in that hypothesis, we would place the independent variable and the dependent variable. And this is something that is often confused, so pay very close attention here. The independent variable is the variable in an experiment that we manipulate as the experimenter. The dependent variable is the variable that changes in response to what we are doing. So I could give you a little example here with a simple plant growth experiment. Let's say I'm going to be growing some beans, and I'm interested in how the amount of water might affect the growth rate. So a super simple experiment, we probably know what's going to happen there, but it illustrates, well, what variable is what? Is the water the independent variable, or is it the dependent variable? You have to ask yourself, well, what is the experimenter changing? In this case, the experimenter is changing the amount of water that is being given to these bean plants, and so therefore it would be the independent variable. That's what you do. You can also think of the independent variable as being the cause, the causative agent that will produce an effect in the dependent variable, which in this case is, you guessed it, the plant growth. So we give it water, we see what happens. Does it grow more? Does it grow less? There's always going to be, a relationship. Well, not always. Sometimes there is no effect, and we call that a null hypothesis. But before we get to that, what if I water too much? The plant will be growing, 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 and then there'll be a point of diminishing returns where we actually see a decrease in growth as we're giving the plant too much water. And maybe you've done that. You've drowned some plants at home. I have a tendency to do that. I'm an classic overwaterer of all the plants. And my wife has told me that I'm not allowed to water the plants. Anyways, so independent variable, dependent variable, super important. Okay, let's go back to this slide for a second and let's plug in, based on the example I was just talking about, the plant growth and water variables into a hypothesis. How would you write your hypothesis in an if, then, because statement? You might say something like, if water is given to the plant, then the plant will grow more. Something like that. You could probably revise that to sound a little more sciencey, but generally the experimental or the independent variable, notice how that has two names, also really confusing. Independent variable goes first. It's also known as the experimental variable. Then, this is our effect. Here goes the dependent variable, or we could also call it the response variable, and this is going to be our plant growth. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think if I water the plants, then we're going to get more growth? Write that, and then give me a because. Why? Because plants need water to do photosynthesis. Or maybe you don't even know about photosynthesis yet, but you just have this kind of experience that things grow better when they're watered, and that is true. Okay. Okay, in an attempt to keep these videos to 10 minutes or less, I'll finish this one up with talking about constants in an experiment. Constants are these things that make or break experiments. What they are things that stay the same. Let's keep going with our plant growth experiment. Would it make sense to use different species of plants? No. If I'm comparing bean plants and poppy plants, well, those are two different types of plants. They're going to respond to water possibly differently. And so I want to keep everything the same that I can in controlled experiment so that I know that what I'm changing is what's causing the effect. If I change more than one thing, if I have like 3 different independent variables, how do I know which variable is really producing the effect? And so what we would say is that those variables are confounding the experiment. They're confusing us. We don't really know what is the cause. It could be any of the 3 things that we were changing. So generally, if you can, now this is not always possible, but if we can, we'd like to change one thing at a time. I'm going to want to keep the plants at the same temperature. I'm going to want to keep the plants exposed to the same amount of light. I'm going to want to use the same soil type. All of those variables or things that could be changed or that might affect the growth, let's keep those the same. And let's only change the amount of water that we give to the plant. So all of those things that we keep the same, we're going to call constants in an experiment. Okay, and I'll stop here.